Earlier this week, both the US President, Donald Trump, and the UK Prime Ministerial candidate, Boris Johnson, praised Australia's tough stance on immigration and asylum seekers. So just what are Australia's current policies on refugees, asylum seekers, and how have they changed over the past 5 years?
Fiona Chong and Jane McAdam are just about to release their new book called Refugee Rights and Policy Wrongs, which outlines Australia in refugee laws and policies. To tell us about it is Professor Jane McAdam, who's the Director of the Caldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
First of all, what percentage of Australia's immigration intake are refugees?
Well, at the moment it's less than 10%, and it's really interesting to look back in history because actually at the end of the Second World War some 48% of people who came to Australia were refugees or displaced people.
So it's a small percent. Do you think that people across Australia broadly know that, given the rhetoric we hear around asylum seekers?
I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, which is one of the main reasons why we wrote this book. But I think that generally, and if you do polling, a lot of people think that the number of refugees coming to Australia is much, much higher.
That number of people coming in, they're coming in through legal channels. Those are not people who are arriving on our shores in boats. Those are people who have waited in the metaphorical queue that people talk about, coming through the front door.
Well, I mean, it's legal to seek asylum as a matter of international law, however you come. But the way that Australia's system works, that number does still account for people who might arrive, for instance, by plane and claim asylum, as well as people who are resettled from other countries.
Yeah, that's the resettlement that I guess I'm asking about. Like, what proportion of the people who come here as refugees arrive on a plane and say, oh, by the way, I'm here to claim asylum, and what proportion are being resettled from other places where their asylum claims have already been processed and we're saying, all right, this is part of our refugee intake?
Well, the way that the Australian government has tried to shift it is to bring more people in, the people that they choose through resettlement. The number of people who claim asylum by plane has increased, but what's really interesting is when you compare that to the numbers coming by boat, up to 90% of people who were coming by boat were found to be refugees, whereas the bulk of people coming by plane and then articulating an asylum claim are found that they're not necessarily refugees.
What are the international obligations that Australia is meant to abide by, and how enforceable are those guidelines?
Well, under international law, as I mentioned before, everyone has a right to seek asylum, and a fundamental obligation is that Australia doesn't turn people around when they say that they have a real fear of being persecuted or subjected to other serious human rights abuses. On top of that, we've got obligations not to hold people in indefinite detention, something we flout consistently.
So we've got those obligations,
That's right.
But how enforceable are they?
Well, that's then the question. Everyone says, well, so what? International law relies on governments abiding by the promises that they've made voluntarily. Now, these are obligations Australia has stood up and said, yep, we'll follow those, and yet we're clearly not. The difficulty, of course, is then when the rubber hits the road, what happens? And when it comes to refugee law, we haven't seen a lot of protesting by other governments. But that's not to say that they couldn't, and certainly we know Australia thinks international law is pretty important when it comes to things like trade or whaling, when we've gone to the International Court of Justice to enforce our rights.
When you say it's legal for anyone to seek asylum, a lot of people will say, well, yes, but what if you cross over other safe haven countries in order to get here? We're sort of the last stop. So if you're coming from Syria, it's totally legitimate to seek asylum somewhere. But is it legitimate to hopscotch across Malaysia and Indonesia and then get to Australia to seek asylum if there could have been a resettlement somewhere along the way?
That's a really good point, because Malaysia and Indonesia are not signatories to the Refugee Convention, and so they are not safe countries for people to claim asylum in. There's nothing in international law that says you must stop and seek asylum in the first country you reach. And that's why I think this idea that people are just sort of forum shopping is actually wrong, because if you look at where Australia is situated, we are generally the first country someone will reach where you can safely claim protection.
We mentioned earlier that Donald Trump and Boris Johnson had praised Australia's policies, and Donald Trump retweeted some pictures about Keep Out, and there were some images of Australia's policies on those that he tweeted out. Isn't that message designed for a particular person, the people smuggler, who would be seeking out people to take them on a boat and to deter that? Isn't that what that message is for?
Well, in many respects, I think that message is actually for a domestic political audience to say we're tough on border security. I don't think there are many asylum seekers who are sitting there looking at those images. And for the people smugglers as well, what we have to recognise is that they are filling a gap in the market, if you like. If there were safe and legal pathways or lawful pathways for people to take, then they would. We know that the majority of people would love to be able to fly in safely to Australia and claim asylum that way. And in fact, if you look at the exorbitant cost, it's $600,000 a person to keep people in offshore processing. Think of how much that, you could fly someone in here first class and keep them in a 5-star hotel for a couple of years for that amount. So we could do this if there was the political will.
Lastly, Jane, one of the things that you take on in your books is what you might call the humanitarian argument in favour of Australia's draconian refugee policy, which is if you can stop the boats, then you stop people from drowning at sea. So it might be unpleasant to do here, but doing it is in the long run actually the humanitarian thing to do, because you prevent people from embarking on a dangerous voyage in the first place. What's wrong with that?
Well, obviously no one wants to see people dying at sea, but what we're doing here is pushing the problem out of sight, out of mind. We've got more displaced people now than at any time since the end of the Second World War, so people are clearly still in need. It's just that we're not seeing them dying on our watch. They're somewhere else instead.
Professor Jane McAdam, we've run out of time. Thanks so much for coming in this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.